Saturday nights at the Crimson Lounge always carried a particular electricity. I could feel it the moment I tied my black apron around my waist and stepped behind the mahogany bar, the wood polished to such a high shine that it reflected the amber lighting overhead. The club occupied a restored warehouse building in Chicago's West Loop, all exposed brick and industrial beams softened by velvet banquettes and carefully curated artwork that probably cost more than I'd earn in 5 years. 6 months. That's how long I'd been mixing drinks and pretending I belonged in a world where a single bottle of whiskey could run $3,000. 6 months of perfecting my invisibility, of becoming part of the elegant machinery that kept places like this running smoothly. The guests never really looked at bartenders, not properly. We were functional, like the glassware or the ice machine humming steadily in the corner. I preferred it that way. "You're doing that thing again," Ryan Mitchell said, sliding up beside me with an empty tray balanced on his palm. His dark hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place despite the crowd pressing 3 deep at the bar. Ryan had worked at Crimson for 4 years and knew every regular by name, every preference, every tip pattern. What thing? I grabbed a bottle of Grey Goose from the speed rack, pouring a precise 2-ounce shot into a shaker without measuring. That faraway look, like you're writing a novel in your head instead of making Cosmos. He grinned, the expression lighting up his whole face. Ryan was one of those people who genuinely enjoyed his job, who found satisfaction in crafting the perfect old-fashioned, or remembering that Mrs. Patel always wanted her martini with extra olives. I wasn't like that. For me, this was just survival. 3 Cosmos, 2 dirty martinis, and a Negroni, I recited, already reaching for the Cointreau. My hands moved through the familiar motions while my mind wandered elsewhere. It usually did during these shifts. The repetition was soothing in its way, a rhythm I could lose myself in. Ryan leaned against the bar, watching me work. "How's your week been?" We barely talked during Thursday's shift. Same as always. I strained the Cosmos into chilled glasses, adding the ceremonial twist of orange peel that made them Instagram-worthy. The club's social media presence was carefully maintained. Everything here was about image, about creating an experience worth documenting. "You working tomorrow?" "Double shift. Need the hours." Ryan's expression softened with understanding he never voiced directly. He knew about my financial situation in vague terms, knew that I picked up every available shift, and never went out with the rest of the staff after closing. He and his husband Carlos had invited me to dinner twice. I'd declined both times, inventing transparent excuses that we both pretended to believe. The truth was, I couldn't afford the luxury of friendship, of spending money on restaurant meals, or taking time away from work. Every dollar went toward the same crushing goal: $47,000 in medical debt. Hospital bills from Lucas's treatment, the aggressive leukemia that had ravaged my older brother for 8 brutal months before taking him 2 years ago. Sometimes I could still smell the antiseptic of his hospital room, could still hear the steady beep of monitors that had eventually flatlined into a sound I'd never forget. "Sophia, you listening?" Ryan waved his hand in front of my face. "The Negroni?" I blinked, refocusing. "Right. Sorry." He gave me a concerned look, but didn't push. That was what I appreciated about Ryan. He cared without demanding explanations, offered support without making me feel like a charity case. In another life, we might have been close friends. In this one, we were friendly co-workers, which was all I could manage. The crowd swelled as the night progressed. Crimson attracted a specific type of clientele: successful, sophisticated, willing to pay premium prices for premium everything. I recognized several faces from television: a local news anchor, a real estate developer whose billboards dotted the highway, a retired baseball player who still commanded attention when he walked into a room. And then there were the others, the ones who didn't seek attention but received it anyway, who moved through the space with an authority that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with power. Christopher Santoro arrived at 11:30, same as he had every Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday for the past 6 months. I didn't need to see him enter to know he was there. The atmosphere shifted, became more attentive somehow. The manager straightened his tie. The security personnel by the VIP section snapped to heightened alertness. Even the music seemed to adjust, becoming slightly more subdued. I focused on pouring a complicated round of shots for a bachelorette party. keeping my eyes on my work, but I was aware of him the way you're aware of a storm building on the horizon. Inevitable. Powerful. Impossible to ignore completely. Christopher Santoro owned the Crimson Lounge, along with several other properties scattered throughout Chicago. That much was public knowledge, easily found with a basic internet search. What wasn't discussed openly, what existed in the realm of careful implication and knowing looks, was the nature of his other business interests. I'd learned quickly not to ask questions, not to show too much curiosity. Ryan had warned me during my first week. Mind your business, do your job, go home. That's the survival guide for this place. But I couldn't help observing. It was a habit born from years of being the quiet one, the watcher, the person who processed the world through careful attention to detail. And in the 6 months since I'd started working here, I'd noticed things about Christopher Santoro that probably said more about me than about him. He was 35, though he carried himself with the certainty of someone older. Dark hair styled with casual precision, the kind that looked effortless, but probably required a $200 haircut. His build suggested someone who actually used his gym membership rather than just paying for one. Tonight, he wore charcoal gray, the fabric draping perfectly across his shoulders. But it was his eyes that always caught my attention. Dark brown, almost black in the club's low lighting. They missed nothing, constantly scanning the room with an alertness that never quite relaxed. Even when he laughed at something one of his companions said, even when he appeared at ease, there was a watchfulness to him that spoke of a man who couldn't afford to lower his guard. I knew something about that, about always being vigilant, always calculating risks, always preparing for the next crisis. Maybe that's why I found myself writing about him in my diary, trying to understand what I recognized in someone so completely different from myself. The diary was leather-bound, brown and worn smooth from years of handling. Lucas had given it to me for my 18th birthday, back when he was healthy, and our biggest concern was whether I'd get into my first-choice college. "You see things other people miss, Soph," he'd said, pressing it into my hands. "You should write them down." I'd filled 3 diaries since then. This was my 4th, and it had become something between a journal and a lifeline. In its pages, I could be honest about the exhaustion that never quite faded, about the grief that hadn't diminished despite time's passage, about the fear that I'd be drowning in debt for the rest of my life. And lately, I'd been writing about Christopher Santoro, not in any romantic sense, nothing like that. But there was something compelling about watching him, about trying to decode the careful distance he maintained from his own inner circle. He sat in the VIP section now, the elevated area that overlooked the main floor. His usual table, his usual position with his back to the wall, and clear sightlines to every entrance. 4 men accompanied him tonight, all dressed with similar understated expense. I recognized them as regulars, part of his constant rotation of associates. Nicholas Ferraro sat to Christopher's right, laughing at something, his gestures expansive and performative. I'd noticed Nicholas before, had developed an instinctive wariness around him that I couldn't quite explain. He was handsome in a practiced way, charming when he wanted to be, always ready with a joke or a flattering comment to the waitstaff. But there was something off about him, something that felt calculated rather than genuine. The way his friendliness never quite reached his eyes. The way he watched people when he thought they weren't looking, his expression hardening into something cold before snapping back to affability. And Christopher kept distance from him. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But there, he never turned his back to Nicholas, never relaxed his posture completely when they spoke. It was the kind of body language you only noticed if you were paying close attention, which, apparently, I was. "Stop staring at the VIP section," Ryan murmured, passing by with a tray of champagne flutes. "You're being obvious." I jerked my attention back to my work, heat flooding my cheeks. "I wasn't staring." "Sure you weren't." His tone was teasing, but carried an undercurrent of genuine warning. "Just be careful, okay? Those aren't men you want noticing you." Too late, I thought, but didn't say. Christopher had looked directly at me exactly 3 times in 6 months. Brief moments where our eyes had met accidentally, where something indecipherable had passed between us before he'd looked away. I'd written about those moments in my diary, trying to understand why they'd stayed with me. why I'd replayed them in quiet moments when I should have been sleeping. It didn't mean anything. Couldn't mean anything. We existed in completely different worlds, and the thin overlap where I served drinks in his club was the only connection we'd ever have. Which was fine. More than fine. I had no space in my life for complications, for distractions, for anything beyond the grinding daily work of survival and debt repayment. The bachelorette party finally moved away from the bar, their shots consumed and paid for, with a generous tip that I'd split with Ryan at the end of the night. A brief lull gave me a moment to breathe, to roll my shoulders against the tension that had built up over the past 3 hours. I pulled my diary from my bag, tucked safely beneath the bar. I shouldn't have brought it to work. Knew it was risky. But I'd discovered that jotting observations during breaks helped me process the chaos of these shifts. Just a few sentences, quick impressions that I'd expand on later when I was alone in my studio apartment. Opening to a fresh page, I wrote quickly. Saturday, 11:47 p.m. CS in the VIP again. Same table, same positioning. NF unusually animated tonight, trying too hard to engage. CS maintaining that careful distance, polite, but guarded. He doesn't trust N completely. Why? What are you always writing in that thing? Ryan appeared with another order, his curiosity finally getting the better of his usual discretion. I closed the diary quickly. Nothing. Just notes to myself. Secret diary? He waggled his eyebrows melodramatically. Do tell. Are you writing torrid romance novels? Are we all characters in your gothic thriller? Despite everything, I smiled. Something like that. Well, your gothic thriller is about to get busier. I just saw 3 more groups coming in. He grabbed bottles from the call shelf, moving with practiced efficiency. Also, Carlos wants to know if you're free for dinner next Saturday. His sister is visiting from Denver and he's insisting on cooking for an audience. I'm working next Saturday. You're always working, Soph. At some point, you're allowed to have a life outside this place. But that was the thing he didn't understand, couldn't understand. This wasn't just a job to me. It was a mission, a mathematical problem with a specific solution. $47,000 divided by whatever I could scrape together from each paycheck. Every shift brought me incrementally closer to being free of the crushing weight that had settled on my shoulders the day Lucas died, and left me with his medical bills. The hospital didn't care about grief. The collection agencies didn't care that I'd lost the only family I had left. They wanted their money, and I'd give it to them, one backbreaking shift at a time. I tucked the diary back into my bag and dove back into the rhythm of the night. Vodka sodas and whiskey sours, complicated mojitos that required muddling fresh mint, elegant Manhattans garnished with brandied cherries. My hands moved automatically while my thoughts drifted, a dangerous habit I'd developed over months of repetition. Later, during my official break at 1 a.m., I slipped out to the back alley for fresh air. The November cold bit through my thin work shirt, but I welcomed it. The sharp contrast to the overheated press of bodies inside. I sat on the concrete step, pulling my diary out again, using the harsh security light to see the page. I'd written about Christopher Santoro 17 times now. I'd counted. 17 separate entries over 6 months, trying to make sense of my fascination with a man I'd never actually spoken to. What did it say about me that I'd created an entire narrative around someone I didn't know, attributing depth and complexity based on nothing more than observation? Maybe it was easier than dealing with my actual life. Maybe he represented something I couldn't quite name. Some possibility of escape from the grinding reality of debt and loneliness. Or maybe I was just losing my mind one shift at a time. I closed the diary and headed back inside. Back to the noise and the demand and the careful anonymity I'd built around myself. The night stretched ahead, full of orders to fill and tips to earn and debt to chip away at $1 at a time. This was my life now. This was all I could afford for it to be. 4 weeks passed in the rhythm of shifts and sleep, the monotony broken only by my diary entries and the mounting balance in my debt repayment account. $327 closer to freedom. It felt both substantial and impossibly inadequate, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Ryan had stopped inviting me to dinners with Carlos. I appreciated that he'd finally accepted my limitations without taking offense. We settled into a comfortable working relationship, efficient and friendly, without demanding more than I could give. He covered my sections when I needed bathroom breaks, and I did the same for him. We split tips fairly, and didn't ask questions about each other's lives beyond these walls. It was Saturday again. The club packed with the usual weekend crowd, plus a private event that had reserved half the main floor for a corporate celebration. The energy felt different tonight, charged with something I couldn't identify. The manager, Thomas Whitmore, moved through the space with unusual tension in his shoulders, checking his watch repeatedly and adjusting his already perfect tie. I was restocking the garnish station when he appeared at my elbow, making me jump. "Sophia, I need you to take something upstairs." I looked up from the lime wedges I'd been arranging. Upstairs? I thought VIP service was Jessica's responsibility. Jessica called in sick. His jaw worked, and I noticed a sheen of sweat on his upper lip despite the club's carefully controlled temperature. "We have an important private meeting in the second-floor salon. They've requested a specific bottle from the reserve collection." The second floor was off-limits to regular staff. I'd never been up there in 6 months of working at Crimson. Even the cleaning crew required special clearance and signed non-disclosure agreements for that level. "Wouldn't it be better if you took it?" I suggested carefully. "I don't even know where the second-floor salon is." "I can't leave the floor. Not tonight." Thomas pulled a small key from his pocket, pressing it into my palm. "Third door on the right once you reach the top of the stairs. Knock twice. Wait for acknowledgement. Enter. Place the tray on the sideboard and leave immediately. Don't make conversation. Don't linger. Don't look at anyone directly." The instructions felt both excessive and ominous. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. You're the only person available." His voice dropped lower. "Please, Sophia. It's important that this goes smoothly." I'd never heard him say please before. The desperation in his tone made refusing feel impossible, like I'd be abandoning him in crisis. Against every instinct screaming caution, I nodded. He exhaled with visible relief. "The bottle is already prepared. Bar 3, under the counter in the locked cabinet. This key opens everything." I found the bottle where he'd indicated, nestled in a velvet-lined box. The label was in Italian, the date 1947. I didn't want to know what something that old cost. Didn't want to calculate how many shifts it represented. Carefully, I transferred it to a silver tray, along with 4 crystal tumblers that probably each cost more than my monthly rent. The stairs to the second floor were tucked behind an unmarked door near the restrooms. I climbed slowly, hyper-aware of every step, terrified of tripping and shattering thousands of dollars worth of whiskey and glassware. The second floor was quieter, insulated from the music below. Plush carpet absorbed my footsteps, and art that looked genuinely valuable lined the hallway walls. Third door on the right. Black lacquered wood with brass fixtures. I balanced the tray on one hand and knocked twice, my knuckles barely making a sound against the solid door. For a moment, I thought no one had heard. Then a voice from inside, muffled but audible. "Enter." The salon was smaller than I'd expected, intimate rather than grand. Leather chairs surrounded an oval table of dark wood that gleamed under low lighting. 5 men sat or stood around it, all wearing variations of expensive suits. The air smelled of cigar smoke and something metallic that I couldn't immediately place. Then I noticed the blood. One of the seated men held a white cloth to his face, crimson seeping through the fabric. His left eye was swelling shut, and his lip had split badly enough that blood dripped onto his collar. The other men's attention was focused on him with varying degrees of concern and calculation. Christopher Santoro stood at the head of the table, his posture radiating controlled authority. He'd removed his jacket, and his white shirt was rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. His expression was calm, almost thoughtful, but there was steel underneath that made my survival instincts scream. Nicholas Ferraro leaned against the wall to Christopher's right, a gun held casually in his hand like it was an extension of his body. He was smiling, that performative friendliness I'd always found unsettling, now transformed into something openly predatory. The conversation stopped the moment I entered. 5 pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I crossed to the sideboard, my hands shaking so badly that the glassware clinked against the tray. The sound seemed deafening in the sudden silence. "Your whiskey, gentlemen." My voice came out steadier than I felt. I set the tray down with exaggerated care, focusing entirely on the mechanical task. "Don't look up. Don't make eye contact. Place the bottle, arrange the glasses, turn around and leave. Thank you. Christopher's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. I nodded and pivoted toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere. But as I turned, my gaze inadvertently swept across the injured man's face. Time seemed to fracture. His good eye met mine, and something in that brief connection triggered a cascade of recognition that I couldn't immediately process. The shape of his face, even swollen and bloodied, the way his jaw set, the scar interrupting his left eyebrow, barely visible beneath the bruising, but there, I knew that face. My breath caught, but I forced myself to keep moving, to walk normally to the door and close it behind me with careful gentleness. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, heart hammering so hard I felt lightheaded. Why did I recognize him? Where had I seen that face before? The descent back to the main floor passed in a blur. I returned Thomas's key without meeting his eyes, muttered something about the delivery being completed, and retreated to the bar where Ryan was handling 3 orders simultaneously. You okay? He glanced at me between pouring shots. You look like you saw a ghost. I'm fine. Just need my break. I didn't wait for his response, heading straight for the staff locker room. It was empty, the other servers still occupied with the Saturday rush. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, sinking onto the bench that ran along one wall. That face. That scar. I opened my photo gallery, scrolling past recent screenshots and work schedules to the folder I'd labeled Lucas. I kept everything related to my brother here, every photo and document, unable to delete even the painful ones. Near the bottom, I found what I was looking for. The security camera image. Daniel Grant, the private investigator I'd hired with my entire savings 2 years ago, had obtained it from a camera near the alley where Lucas died. The police had never requested it, too eager to close the case as a random mugging, but Daniel had canvassed every business in a 3-block radius until he found this single frame. A figure leaving the alley, face partially visible as he turned toward the camera. The image quality was terrible, pixelated and grainy, taken from an awkward angle that obscured details. But I'd stared at this photo hundreds of times, trying to will it into clarity, trying to identify the person who'd been there when my brother took his last breath. I'd memorized every visible feature. The build, the posture, the scar on the left eyebrow that the investigator had circled in the enhanced version he'd provided. With shaking fingers, I zoomed in on the face, then pulled up my browser and searched for Nicholas Ferraro. Images populated immediately, professional shots from charity events and business functions. I compared them side by side with the security footage. The scar, the jawline, the way he carried his shoulders. It was him. Nicholas Ferraro had been in that alley. Nicholas Ferraro had been there when Lucas died. For 2 years, I'd searched for this person, dreamed of finding them, imagined what I'd do with that information. And for 6 months, I'd unknowingly served him drinks, smiled politely when he made jokes, accepted his tips with gratitude. I'd been in the same room with my brother's killer dozens of times, and I'd never known. The locker room tilted, and I had to put my head between my knees to keep from passing out. Nausea rolled through me in waves. All this time working at Crimson, observing Christopher Santoro's organization from my invisible position behind the bar, and Lucas's murderer had been right there. Was Christopher involved? Had he ordered it? Lucas had worked as a junior accountant at some import company, nothing that should have connected him to organized crime. But clearly, something had. I needed to document this, needed to write it down while the recognition was fresh, while the certainty burned in my mind. Later I could figure out what to do with the information, how to use it, whether to take it to the police or what. What could I do against men like them? I pulled my diary from my bag, the leather familiar and grounding beneath my fingers. The pages fell open to today's entry, the brief notes I'd made during my earlier break about a difficult customer and Ryan's upcoming anniversary with Carlos. Normal concerns from a different lifetime, written by someone who didn't yet know the truth. I flipped to a fresh page and began writing, my hand moving so fast the letters barely stayed legible. I documented everything. The scene upstairs, Nicholas with the gun, the injured man, the moment of recognition. The comparison between the security footage and Nicholas's face. The scar that matched perfectly. The features that aligned despite years and poor image quality. The words poured out of me in a desperate rush, as if committing them to paper would make them real, would give me some measure of control over information that felt like it was burning a hole through my consciousness. Finally, I reached the last line, my hand cramping from the speed and pressure of writing. I stared at the blank space, trying to articulate the enormity of what I'd discovered. How did you sum up something that changed everything, that reframed 6 months of your life into a cruel joke? I wrote, Nicholas Ferraro was in the alley. Photo from 2 years ago. He killed my brother. I worked 6 months serving drinks to Lucas's killer. The pen slipped from my fingers. Outside the locker room, I could hear the muffled bass of music, the distant sound of voices and laughter. The club continued its expensive revelry, everyone oblivious to the fact that my entire world had just shattered and reformed into something unrecognizable. Thunder rumbled overhead, audible even through the building's thick walls. A storm had moved in while I'd been spiraling, the kind of sudden downpour that Chicago specialized in during autumn. I needed to leave. Needed to get out of this building, away from Nicholas Ferraro and whatever violence was happening in that upstairs salon. Needed space to think, to process, to figure out what came next. I shoved the diary back into my bag and stood on unsteady legs. My shift didn't end for another 3 hours. But I couldn't stay. Couldn't go back to the bar and mix drinks with steady hands. Couldn't pretend everything was normal. Thomas would be angry. I might lose my job. But none of that mattered compared to the revelation clawing at my chest, demanding acknowledgement, demanding action. I typed out a quick text to Ryan. Family emergency. Had to leave. I'm so sorry. Then I burst through the back door into the alley, into rain that immediately soaked through my work clothes. The cold shocked my system, grounding me in physical sensation when my thoughts threatened to spiral into panic. I ran toward the street, toward the bus stop, toward anywhere that wasn't here. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached, until I reached my apartment and stumbled up 4 flights of stairs, until I collapsed on my bed, fully clothed and shaking. Only then did I realize what I'd done. My bag was still in the locker room at Crimson. My wallet was in my jacket pocket, my keys in my hand. But my bag, with my diary inside, documenting everything I'd just discovered, naming Nicholas Ferraro as a killer, was sitting on that bench where anyone could find it. The panic didn't hit immediately. That's what I remember most clearly about that night. The strange, delayed reaction, like my body understood the danger before my conscious mind could process it. I stood in my apartment, dripping rainwater onto the second-hand rug, staring at my empty hands. Keys, wallet, phone. The essentials were all accounted for, clutched in my death grip as I'd fled through the storm. But my bag, the canvas tote I'd used every single day for 6 months, was still sitting on that bench in the Crimson Lounge staff locker room, with my diary inside. The diary that now contained a written accusation of murder against Nicholas Ferraro, detailed observations about Christopher Santoro's organization, and enough information to get me killed if the wrong person found it. My legs gave out. I sat heavily on the edge of my bed, still in my soaked work clothes, and tried to breathe through the tightness constricting my chest. This couldn't be happening. I couldn't have been that stupid, that careless, but I had been. In my panic to escape, to put distance between myself and the revelation burning through my consciousness, I'd left behind the one piece of evidence that could destroy me. The clock on my microwave read 11:47 p.m. Crimson closed at 3 on Saturdays, which meant the cleaning crew would be there until at least 4 a.m. My locker wasn't locked, because the cheap combination mechanism had broken weeks ago, and I'd never bothered reporting it. Anyone could open it. Anyone could find my bag. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called Ryan. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail, his cheerful greeting feeling obscene against my rising terror. Ryan, it's Sophia. I know I left without explanation and I'm so sorry, but I really need your help. I left my bag in the locker room and I need someone to grab it for me before the club closes. Please, if you get this, can you text me? I'll owe you forever. I hung up and immediately regretted the desperate edge in my voice. Ryan would have questions, concerns. But there was no help for it now. I tried calling again. Voicemail again. He was probably still slammed with the Saturday crowd, phone tucked away in his locker where he couldn't hear it. Think, Sophia. Think. I could go back. The club was still open for another 3 hours. I could show up, apologize to Thomas for the emergency exit, grab my bag, and leave. Simple. Except that Nicholas Ferraro was still there, and I'd just identified him as my brother's killer. The thought of being in the same building as him, of potentially crossing paths in a hallway or stairwell, made my stomach lurch. But the alternative was worse. Leaving that diary where anyone could find it, where Nicholas himself might stumble across it while making his usual rounds. He seemed like the type who'd read a staff member's forgotten diary just to gather leverage, to collect secrets he could exploit. I changed out of my wet clothes with mechanical movements, pulling on jeans and a hoodie, my hair still dripping down my back. The mirror showed someone I barely recognized, eyes too wide, face drained of color, lips pressed into a bloodless line. Lucas used to say I looked like our mother when I was scared. She'd died when I was 12. Cancer eating through her faster than any treatment could slow. Lucas had been 17, suddenly responsible for raising a grieving preteen while finishing high school. He'd done it without complaint, working part-time jobs and maintaining his grades, making sure I never felt abandoned even as we navigated the foster system until he turned 18 and could claim legal guardianship. And I'd failed him. Failed to protect him, failed to get justice for him. And now I'd potentially failed again by leaving evidence of his murder in a place where his killer could destroy it. The guilt was suffocating. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, then stopped. Going back to Crimson meant confronting whatever was happening in that upstairs salon. It meant potentially seeing the aftermath of whatever violence Nicholas had been orchestrating with that gun. It meant walking back into danger with my eyes open. But staying here meant losing the only documentation of what I'd discovered. The only proof that I'd connected Nicholas to Lucas's death. My phone buzzed. Ryan calling back. Sophia, what's going on? Are you okay? His voice carried concern and the muffled background noise of the club in full swing. I'm fine. I just need my bag from the locker room. Can you grab it for me? I'll come get it from you tomorrow. A pause. The bag with your diary? Sophia. Thomas already took it. My heart stopped. What? The cleaning manager found it around midnight and brought it to Thomas. Standard protocol for lost items. Thomas said he'd try to get it back to you. Maybe look for contact info inside. Ryan's tone shifted, becoming more alert. Why? What's in that diary that's got you so spooked? Everything. My entire catastrophic discovery. Written in ink that couldn't be erased. In handwriting that was unmistakably mine. Nothing, it's just personal. Do you know if Thomas looked through it? I don't know. He took it up to his office. Sophia, what's really going on? You ran out during your shift without a word and now you're freaking out about your diary. Talk to me. I couldn't. Telling Ryan would put him in danger too, would make him complicit in knowledge that could get him hurt. Nicholas Ferraro didn't leave loose ends. Ryan had said that himself during my first week, warning me about the kind of people who frequented Crimson's VIP sections. I can't explain right now. Just please, if you see my bag, if you see anyone with it, can you let me know? You're scaring me. I'm scared too. The admission slipped out before I could stop it. Ryan, I need you to trust me. Don't mention this conversation to anyone, especially not Thomas or any of the VIP regulars. Please. Another pause. Longer this time. I could practically hear him processing, connecting dots I desperately didn't want him to connect. Okay, he finally said. I trust you. But Sophia, if you're in trouble, real trouble, you need to tell someone. The police, a lawyer, someone who can actually help. The police. The same ones who'd closed Lucas's case in 3 days, who'd accepted the robbery narrative without investigation, who'd never even requested the security footage that had cost me $2,000 to obtain from a private investigator. I will. Just not yet. Thank you, Ryan. Really. I ended the call before he could press further and sank back onto my bed. Thomas had my diary. Thomas, who answered directly to Christopher Santoro, who managed the club on behalf of its owner, which meant the diary was essentially in Christopher's domain. 1 degree of separation from the man whose organization I'd been documenting, and more critically, 1 degree of separation from Nicholas Ferraro. The night stretched ahead of me, infinite and suffocating. I tried to sleep and couldn't, my mind cycling through increasingly catastrophic scenarios. Thomas reading the diary and bringing it to Christopher's attention. Christopher reading my observations about him. My pathetic attempts to understand a man I had no business analyzing. Nicholas somehow getting his hands on it. Seeing his name connected to Lucas's death. By 2 a.m., I was pacing my small apartment, wearing a path in the carpet between the door and the window. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening under streetlights. Somewhere out there, in a club I'd fled hours ago, my diary existed as evidence of both my discovery and my stupidity. I pulled up Daniel Grant's contact information on my phone. The private investigator who'd helped me 2 years ago was probably asleep. But maybe he'd have advice. Maybe he could tell me what to do with the information I'd uncovered. The call went to an automated message saying the number was no longer in service. I tried his email next, typing out a frantic explanation before realizing I had no idea if he even checked that address anymore. Our last communication had been 18 months ago, when he'd apologized for hitting dead ends in Lucas's case and refunded half his fee. I was alone in this. Completely, terrifyingly alone. At 3:17 a.m., according to the clock that I'd been watching obsessively, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Thomas Whitmore. I have your bag from the locker room. Need to speak with you urgently about its contents. Please call me when you receive this message, regardless of the hour." My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. He'd read it. Of course he'd read it. He'd opened the diary looking for contact information, and found instead a confession that one of his employer's associates was a killer. What happened next would depend entirely on whose side Thomas was on, whose loyalty he served. If he took the diary to Nicholas, I was dead. If he took it to Christopher, I had no idea what would happen. But it couldn't be good. I stared at the message for 20 minutes, paralyzed by indecision. Calling him back meant acknowledging the diary's contents, meant confirming that yes, I had written those accusations. Yes, I had been observing Christopher Santoro's organization with an attention that went far beyond my role as bartender. Not calling him back meant waiting for consequences to find me, meant hiding in my apartment like prey waiting for the predator to strike. Neither option offered safety. Neither option gave me control. But at least if I called, I'd know what was coming. I pressed dial before I could reconsider, and Thomas answered on the first ring. "Sophia." His voice was tight, strained. "Where are you right now?" "Home. In my apartment." "Are you alone? Is anyone with you?" The questions felt ominous, loaded with implications I didn't want to examine. "I'm alone. Thomas, I can explain the diary. I was just processing some things, and I didn't mean for anyone to read it, and—" "Stop talking." The command was sharp enough to cut through my rambling panic. "Listen very carefully. Your diary is not with me anymore. I found it, saw enough to understand you'd observed something you shouldn't have, and I did what I'm required to do in these situations. I brought it to Mr. Santoro." The room tilted. Christopher Santoro had my diary, the man I'd been secretly documenting, whose loneliness and isolation I'd chronicled like some obsessed stalker, now had access to every word I'd written about him. And worse, he now knew that I'd identified Nicholas Ferraro as a murderer. "Sophia, are you still there?" "Yes." My voice came out as barely a whisper. "Mr. Santoro read everything. He knows about your brother, about Nicholas, about your recognition of him tonight. He's been trying to locate you for the past 2 hours. Thomas paused. "He's not angry, but he's concerned. Very concerned about your safety. My safety." I repeated the words like they were foreign, incomprehensible. "Nicholas Ferraro is dangerous. If he discovers that you witnessed tonight's meeting, if he realizes you've connected him to your brother's death, you're in immediate danger. Mr. Santoro has mobilized his security team to find you first, to ensure you're protected before Nicholas can reach you." Protected. The word should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like another form of captivity, like trading one threat for another. I don't want protection. I just want to be left alone. That's not an option anymore. Thomas's tone gentled slightly. "You saw something. You know something. That changes everything. Mr. Santoro is on his way to you now. He'll explain better than I can, but Sophia, you need to understand that running isn't safe. Hiding isn't safe. The only safe option is accepting help from someone who can actually protect you. The line went dead before I could respond. I stood frozen in my apartment, still holding the phone, processing the reality of my situation. Christopher Santoro was coming here. To my home. Because I'd been stupid enough to write down observations I should have kept locked inside my head. Because I'd connected dots that had stayed hidden for 2 years. Because I couldn't just serve drinks and mind my own business like Ryan had warned me. A car engine purred to a stop outside my building. I moved to the window and looked down at the street, where a black sedan sat idling, its windows too dark to see through. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Miss Wells, this is Joseph Grimaldiro, head of security for Mr. Santoro. I'm outside your building with a team. Mr. Santoro is 5 minutes away. We need you to come down now. Your apartment isn't secure. How did you get my address? Your employment file. Miss Wells, we don't have time for questions. Nicholas Ferraro's people are looking for you too. We intercepted communication indicating they're checking addresses associated with staff who had access to the second floor tonight. You need to come with us now. Through the window, I saw 2 men exit the sedan. They moved with purpose toward my building's entrance. Their postures alert. Professional. Not threatening, exactly. But not comforting either. I was out of options. Out of time. Out of any illusion that I could navigate this situation alone. Grabbing my keys and phone, I headed for the door, stepping into consequences I'd never intended to create, walking toward a future I couldn't predict. The only certainty was that my life as I'd known it, the careful invisibility I'd maintained, the grinding routine of debt and survival, was over. Christopher Santoro had my diary. He knew everything. And whatever came next would be written by his hand, not mine. Sleep was impossible. I lay on my bed fully clothed, staring at the water-stained ceiling of my apartment, watching shadows shift as occasional cars passed on the street below, every creak of the building settling, every distant siren, every footstep in the hallway above sent my heart racing with irrational terror that Nicholas Ferraro had somehow found me already, but it wasn't Nicholas I should have been worried about. It was my own stupidity. Around 4 a.m, as gray dawn light began filtering through my thin curtains, the full scope of my mistake crystallized with horrifying clarity. My bag wasn't just sitting innocuously on that bench in the staff locker room. Inside my bag, tucked into the side pocket where I always kept it, was my employee badge. The badge with my full name, my address, my apartment number. I sat up so fast the room spun. The employee badge. How could I have forgotten about the employee badge? Crimson Lounge required all staff to keep their identification on them at all times for security purposes. Mine was a plastic card with my photo, name, and the address I'd provided when I filled out my hiring paperwork 6 months ago. Which meant anyone who found my bag wouldn't just discover a diary full of dangerous observations. They'd have a map directly to my door. The panic that had been simmering all night erupted into full-blown terror. I grabbed my phone and tried calling Ryan again. It rang and rang before clicking to voicemail. I'd already left him 3 messages since fleeing the club. This would be my 4th. Ryan, please. I know it's early, but I really need to talk to you. Please call me back as soon as you get this. I hung up and immediately dialed again. Same result. Again. Again. By the time dawn fully broke, painting my studio apartment in shades of gray and gold, I'd called Ryan 15 times. On the 16th attempt, his husband Carlos answered, his voice groggy with sleep. Sophia, it's 5:30 in the morning. Is someone dead? Carlos, I'm so sorry, but I really need to talk to Ryan. Is he there? He's asleep. We both were until about 5 minutes ago when his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Carlos sounded more concerned than annoyed now. What's going on? Are you okay? I just need to talk to him about something from work. It's important. A rustling sound. Then Carlos's voice became muffled as he presumably covered the phone. I heard the low rumble of conversation. Then Ryan came on the line. Sophia, what's wrong? Carlos says you've been calling nonstop. Where are you? Milwaukee. We drove up yesterday afternoon to visit Carlos's family, remember? I mentioned it last week. His voice carried that patient tone people use when explaining something obvious to someone who's not thinking clearly. We're not back until Monday evening. Sophia, talk to me. What happened after you left? Milwaukee. Of course. He'd mentioned the trip during Thursday's shift, complaining good-naturedly about having to meet Carlos's extended family for the first time. I'd been so wrapped up in my own crisis that the information had completely fled my mind. I need you to do something for me. I left my bag in the locker room last night, and I need someone to grab it before anyone else finds it. Your bag with the diary. It wasn't a question. Ryan knew how protective I was of that leather-bound book, had seen me writing in it during countless breaks. Sophia, what's in that diary that's got you so scared? I couldn't tell him. Couldn't put him in danger by making him complicit in knowledge that could get him hurt. Nicholas Ferraro didn't leave loose ends, and Ryan was too good, too kind to deserve being tangled in whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. Just personal stuff. Really personal. Please, Ryan. A long pause. I could practically hear him processing, weighing my desperation against his concern. I can't help you from Milwaukee. I'm 3 hours away, but I can call Thomas. Ask him to secure your bag until... No. The word came out too sharp, too panicked. Don't call Thomas. Don't tell anyone at the club that I'm looking for it. Please. Now you're really scaring me. Ryan's voice dropped lower, probably moving away from wherever Carlos was. Does this have something to do with why you ran out last night? With whatever you saw upstairs? I'd forgotten that Ryan knew I'd been sent to the second floor. Of course he knew. In a place like Crimson, information circulated faster than rumors. I can't explain right now. Just promise me you won't tell anyone we had this conversation. Especially not Thomas or any of the regulars in VIP. Sophia, if you're in real trouble, you need actual help. Police, lawyers, someone who can... I have to go. I ended the call before he could press further, before my resolve crumbled, and I told him everything, dragging him into danger alongside me. I pulled up my banking app with shaking fingers. The balance mocked me. $340. Barely enough for a bus ticket out of Chicago. Certainly not enough for a bus ticket plus a place to stay while I figured out my next move. And even if I ran, where would I go? I had no family, no friends outside this city, no safety net beyond the grinding routine of work and debt repayment. Running wasn't an option, which left me with only one alternative. I had to go back to Crimson and get that bag before anyone else found it. The thought made my stomach churn with dread, but what choice did I have? If Nicholas discovered the diary, discovered my address, I'd spend whatever time I had left looking over my shoulder, waiting for the inevitable knock on my door. At least if I retrieved it now, in daylight when the club was closed, I'd have a chance. I spent the next few hours researching Daniel Grant, the private investigator who'd helped me 2 years ago. Maybe he still had copies of the security footage. Maybe he could advise me on what to do with the information I'd uncovered. But every number I found for him led to disconnected lines. Every email bounced back as undeliverable. He'd vanished from the internet as thoroughly as if he'd never existed, which left me truly alone. No Ryan, no investigator, no backup plan. At 11:30, I dressed in dark jeans and a hoodie, pulling my hair into a tight ponytail. If anyone saw me entering Crimson, I wanted to be as unremarkable as possible. Just another person in Chicago's Sunday morning landscape, invisible and forgettable. The bus ride to the West Loop took 25 minutes. I spent it staring out the window, watching the city transition from residential neighborhoods to the trendy restaurant district where Crimson occupied its prime corner location. On weekends, this area was packed with brunch crowds and shopping tourists. But Sunday morning still held a hushed quality. Most venues closed until evening service. I got off the bus 3 blocks from the club and walked the rest of the way, keeping my head down. The building looked different in daylight, less intimidating without the crowds and pulsing music. Just an attractive, renovated warehouse with its discreet signage and elegant facade. I circled to the back alley, where staff entrances and loading docks faced away from street traffic. The service door would be here, the one the cleaning crew used. Ryan had mentioned once that they finished their deep clean by noon on Sundays. and the manager left the door unlocked until 1 o'clock for delivery drivers who needed access to restock bar supplies. It was 12:17 according to my phone. Perfect timing. The alley smelled of garbage and rain, puddles from last night's storm still pooling in uneven pavement. I approached the heavy metal door marked staff only and tested the handle. It turned easily, unlocked as expected. Relief washed through me so intensely I had to lean against the doorframe for support. This was going to work. I'd slip inside, check the locker room, grab my bag, and disappear before anyone knew I'd been there. The interior was dim, emergency lighting providing just enough illumination to navigate. I moved through the familiar space, past the industrial kitchen with its gleaming equipment, past the storage areas stacked with liquor boxes, toward the staff section where lockers and changing rooms clustered. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the empty building. Every sound seemed amplified, my breathing harsh in the silence. I kept expecting someone to appear around every corner, to challenge my presence here. But the club remained deserted. The locker room door was propped open. I stepped inside, scanning the benches where I'd sat just last night, writing frantically in my diary while my world fell apart. The bench was empty. No bag, no diary. I checked under the benches, behind the lockers, in every corner where something might have been kicked or moved during cleaning. Nothing. Someone had already taken it. My chest tightened. The cleaning crew would have turned lost items over to management, which meant my bag was probably in Thomas Whitmore's office, or possibly in the club's general lost and found, which I knew was kept in the manager's office on the second floor. The second floor, where I'd witnessed whatever violence had occurred last night, where Nicholas Ferraro had stood with a gun in his hand, smiling his predatory smile. I didn't want to go back up there. Every instinct screamed to leave now, to accept that the diary was lost, and deal with whatever consequences came. But my address was in that bag. My home, my only safe space, was compromised as long as that employee badge existed with my information on it. I had to try. The stairwell to the second floor was even darker than the main level. I climbed slowly, each step feeling like a descent into something I wouldn't be able to climb back out of. At the landing, I paused, listening for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. Silence. The hallway stretched ahead, doors closed and locked, the plush carpet absorbing my footsteps. Thomas's office was 3 doors down on the left. I'd only been inside once during my hiring process, a brief meeting to fill out paperwork and receive my employee badge. The door was unlocked. Another small mercy in a day full of terror. I slipped inside, closing it softly behind me. Thomas's office was meticulously organized, everything in its place. A desk with a computer, filing cabinets, a small table with a coffee maker, and on the credenza behind his desk, a plastic bin labeled Lost and Found. I rifled through it with shaking hands. A phone, a jacket, a set of keys, a water bottle. No canvas bag, no diary. Where else would he have put it? I checked the desk drawers, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. Nothing. The filing cabinets were locked. A sound from the hallway froze me mid-search. Footsteps. Multiple footsteps, heavy and purposeful. Someone else was in the building. I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, somewhere I could wait until whoever it was left. But Thomas's office had no closets, no spaces large enough to conceal a person. Just furniture and walls and a window that didn't open. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I was trapped with nowhere to run, and no explanation for why I was here. Rifling through the manager's office on a Sunday afternoon, when I should have been anywhere else. The doorknob turned. I braced myself for Thomas, for security, for anyone except the person who actually stepped through that door. Christopher Santoro stood in the entrance, my brown leather diary held casually in his right hand. His eyes met mine with an intensity that made the air feel thinner, harder to breathe. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits blocked any potential escape route. Not threatening exactly, but their presence was clear message. Leaving wasn't an option I had anymore. Miss Wells, Christopher's voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made everything worse. I believe we need to talk. My hands were still gripping the edge of Thomas's desk when Christopher Santoro closed the door behind him with a soft click. that sounded deafening in the silent office. The two men who'd been flanking him remained in the hallway, their presence a physical reminder that escape wasn't an option. Christopher moved further into the room with that controlled grace I'd observed countless times from behind the bar. But seeing it directed at me, seeing those dark eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that stripped away every pretense, was entirely different from watching him from a safe distance. He set my diary on Thomas's desk between us, the worn leather looking smaller somehow, less significant than it had felt when I'd been pouring my thoughts into its pages night after night. "You came back for this." It wasn't a question. His voice was low, careful, the kind of tone someone uses when trying not to spook a frightened animal. I couldn't find words. My throat had closed around any explanation I might have offered, leaving me mute and trembling in the middle of an office where I had absolutely no right to be. "Miss Wells, I need you to listen very carefully." Christopher stayed on his side of the desk, maintaining distance that should have been reassuring, but somehow made everything worse. If he'd been angry, if he'd been threatening, I would have known how to react. But this careful gentleness, this measured patience, left me completely off balance. "I'm sorry." The words finally emerged, barely a whisper. "I shouldn't have written those things. I shouldn't have been watching you, observing your business. I was just trying to understand. I'm not concerned about what you wrote about me." He cut through my rambling with quiet authority. "I'm concerned about what you discovered about Nicholas Ferraro." The name hung between us, heavy with implications. I pressed my lips together, trying to control the trembling that had spread from my hands to my entire body. Christopher picked up the diary, opening it to a page he'd apparently marked. "You identified him from security footage taken the night your brother died. Lucas Wells, 29 years old, found in an alley with a fatal stab wound. Police ruled it a robbery gone wrong and closed the case in 72 hours. Hearing him recite the details of Lucas's death in that clinical tone made something crack inside my chest. "How do you know all that?" "Because I ordered an investigation the moment I read your diary." He set it down again, his expression unreadable. "Your brother worked as a junior accountant at Westfield Import Company, one of my legitimate businesses, used for legal operations with some accounting structures that serve other purposes. Money laundering." He didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. Lucas was doing routine quarterly reviews when he flagged inconsistencies in fund transfers, significant amounts being diverted to accounts that didn't match our approved structures. He reported his concerns to his supervisor, Martin Kelly. Christopher's jaw tightened fractionally. What Lucas didn't know was that Martin answered directly to Nicholas Ferraro. And Nicholas was the one creating those inconsistencies, skimming millions over 3 years to fund his own operations separate from my organization. I tried to process the information, but my mind felt sluggish, overwhelmed. "You're saying Nicholas killed my brother to cover up theft?" "I'm saying Nicholas killed your brother to protect a much larger operation. He's been making unauthorized deals with the Sinaloa cartel, promising them territory in Chicago in exchange for protection and resources. The money he diverted was funding this betrayal." Christopher's voice remained calm, but I could hear steel underneath. Lucas's discovery threatened to expose everything. So Nicholas eliminated the threat. "And you didn't know." The statement came out flat, neither question nor accusation. I suspected problems within my organization. Nicholas had been pushing for territorial expansions that made no strategic sense, attending meetings I wasn't informed about, building alliances I didn't authorize. But suspicion isn't proof. His eyes held mine. "I've been investigating him for 6 months, compiling evidence, trying to build a case strong enough to bring before my counsel. One misstep, one premature accusation, and he could have disappeared or started a war I couldn't win." A sound from outside made us both freeze. Voices in the hallway getting closer. Christopher moved to the window with fluid speed, looking down at the street below. His expression hardened. "He's here." "Who?" "Nicholas." Christopher turned back to me, urgency replacing his careful calm. "Sophia, how did you get into the building?" "The service door. It was unlocked for deliveries, which means my security team didn't log your entry. Nicholas won't know you're here yet, but he will soon. The building has surveillance throughout, and someone is monitoring those feeds. Once he reviews today's footage, He'll see me breaking into Thomas's office. My voice came out hollow. He'll see you searching for something. And given what happened last night, given that you witnessed his meeting with cartel intermediaries, he'll connect the pieces. The room felt like it was shrinking, walls pressing in. I didn't mean to see anything. I was just delivering whiskey like Thomas asked me to. I know. But intent doesn't matter to Nicholas. You're a liability now, a witness to operations he can't afford to have exposed. Christopher crossed to the door, listening. The voices outside had moved away, but the reprieve felt temporary. We need to leave. Now, where would we even go? My address is on my employee badge. He probably already. I sent a team to your apartment 3 hours ago. You weren't there. I've had people watching your building since midnight, waiting for you to come home. He pulled out his phone, typing something quickly. Joseph tracked you here through traffic cameras once we realized where you were heading. The realization that I'd been under surveillance, that Christopher Santoro had dedicated resources to finding me, should have been terrifying. Instead, I felt an odd sense of relief that someone had been paying attention, that I hadn't been as alone as I'd thought. Why? I had to ask. Why do you care what happens to me? Christopher looked up from his phone, and for the first time since entering the office, something shifted in his expression. Not quite vulnerability, but close, because you wrote that you saw past my defenses, that beneath everything I've built, you recognize something worth protecting. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. No one has looked at me that way in a very long time, Sophia. And because your brother died on my watch, in my organization, because of a traitor, I failed to stop in time. I owe you more than protection. I owe you justice. Before I could respond, before I could process the weight of what he'd just revealed, the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the street below. Christopher moved to the window again, cursing quietly in Italian under his breath. Nicholas just arrived. We have maybe 2 minutes before he reaches this floor. Panic spiked through me. The service door is being watched by his people now. I saw them take position when I was driving up. They're blocking that exit. He scanned the office quickly. Then his gaze landed on the bookshelf along the far wall. There's another way. He crossed to the shelf and pressed something I couldn't see. A section of the bookcase swung inward with a soft mechanical hum, revealing a dark, narrow passage behind it. Emergency exit. Christopher grabbed my diary from the desk and held out his hand to me. It leads to an old maintenance tunnel system that connects several buildings in this block. We can get out 3 streets over. I stared at the dark opening, then at his outstretched hand. Taking it meant trusting him completely, meant stepping into his world with no guarantee of what waited on the other side. But staying meant facing Nicholas Ferraro. And I knew with absolute certainty that conversation would end badly. The sound of the elevator arriving on our floor made the decision for me. I grabbed Christopher's hand. His fingers closed around mine, warm and steady, and he pulled me toward the hidden passage. We stepped into darkness, just as I heard voices in the hallway outside. Nicholas's distinctive laugh carrying through the closed office door. Christopher pulled the bookcase closed behind us, plunging us into complete blackness. The space was cramped, barely wide enough for us to stand side by side, and smelled of dust and old concrete. I felt Christopher's hand tighten around mine, anchoring me as he used his other hand to navigate, apparently knowing this passage by touch. Stairs ahead, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Stay close to me. We descended slowly, each step careful in the darkness. Above us, I heard the muffled sound of the office door opening, of voices raised in question. Nicholas asking where Thomas was, demanding to know who'd been in the building. I'd left the desk drawers open, the lost and found bin scattered, evidence of my search visible to anyone who looked. He knows someone was there. I whispered. He knows someone was searching. He doesn't know it was you. Not yet. Christopher's voice was calm despite our situation. The cameras in Thomas's office have been disabled for maintenance since yesterday. Security protocol when we're conducting internal investigations. Nicholas can't access that footage because it doesn't exist. Small mercy, but I'd take it. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and Christopher released my hand briefly. I heard the sound of a door being unlocked. Then dim emergency lighting flickered on, revealing a tunnel stretching ahead of us. Concrete walls marked with ancient water stains, pipes running along the ceiling, the kind of infrastructure that existed beneath most old buildings in Chicago. This way. Christopher took my hand again, leading me down the tunnel at a quick walk that bordered on running. Our footsteps echoed despite his attempts at quiet, but there was no help for it. We needed distance, needed to get as far from Crimson Lounge as possible, before Nicholas realized his prey had slipped away. My lungs burned by the time we reached another set of stairs leading upward. Christopher climbed them 2 at a time, still pulling me along, until we emerged into what looked like a maintenance closet in a completely different building. He locked the tunnel door behind us, then led me through the closet into a parking garage. A black sedan waited in the corner, engine running, Joseph Grimaldiro in the driver's seat. "Status?" Christopher asked, opening the back door and guiding me inside. "Nicholas has 4 men searching the club. They found the passage entrance but haven't followed yet. We have maybe 5 minutes before they figure out where it leads." Joseph pulled out of the parking garage smoothly, merging into Sunday afternoon traffic. Christopher slid in beside me, finally releasing my hand now that we were relatively safe. He handed me my diary, which he'd somehow managed to hold on to through our entire escape. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice shaking from adrenaline crash. "Somewhere secure. Somewhere Nicholas won't think to look." Christopher met my eyes in the dim interior of the car. "Sophia, I need you to understand what just happened. You didn't just stumble into danger. You walked into the middle of a war that's been building for months. Nicholas will assume you've sided with me now, that you're cooperating with my investigation. There's no going back to your apartment, your job, your normal life, not until this is resolved." The full weight of my situation finally settled over me. I'd lost everything in the span of 24 hours. My home, my income, my carefully maintained anonymity. And somehow, impossibly, I'd ended up in the protection of the very man I'd been secretly documenting, whose world I'd been trying to understand from safe distance. Christopher was still watching me, waiting for my reaction. I clutched my diary to my chest and made the only choice I could. Then let's resolve it. The safe house was in a quiet suburb, an hour north of Chicago, a 2-story colonial with beige siding that looked like every other house on the block. Generic landscaping, a mailbox with no name, windows with blinds perpetually drawn. Joseph pulled into the garage and closed the door before Christopher and I stepped out of the car. Another layer of invisibility wrapped around us. Inside, the house had that sterile quality of a space maintained but not lived in. Furniture that matched but had no personality, a kitchen stocked with basics but no personal touches, bedrooms with fresh linens but no photographs or books. It was a place designed for temporary occupation, for people who needed to disappear. Christopher led me to a dining room where papers were already spread across the table. Evidence, he'd called it on the drive over. Months of investigation compiled into folders, each labeled with dates and transaction codes I didn't understand. He gestured for me to sit, while Joseph disappeared into another room, presumably to establish whatever security protocols kept places like this safe. "This is everything we have on Nicholas Ferraro's operations." Christopher opened the first folder, revealing bank statements marked with highlighter, numbers circled in red ink. 3 years of financial irregularities. Money diverted from legitimate accounts into offshore structures we couldn't initially trace. It took 6 months just to find the pattern. I leaned forward, studying the documents. Even to my untrained eye, the amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, moving through accounts with names that meant nothing to me. "Lucas found this," I said. Not a question. Part of it. He identified inconsistencies in quarterly reports for Westfield Import. That company handles textiles, legitimate trade, but the accounting structure allows for cash movement that serves other purposes. Lucas noticed funds being transferred to accounts that weren't in our approved network. Christopher pulled out another folder, this one containing surveillance photos. Nicholas meeting with men I didn't recognize, in locations that ranged from upscale restaurants to industrial warehouses. Each photo was dated, time-stamped, annotated with details about who attended and what was discussed based on intelligence gathered afterward. These are his meetings with Sinaloa cartel representatives. They've been negotiating for Chicago territory, promising them distribution networks Nicholas doesn't have authority to offer. He's been using stolen money to fund his side of the bargain. Weapons purchases, protection payments, bribes to law enforcement that should be going through official channels. I picked up one of the photos, studying Nicholas's face. He looked relaxed, confident. Nothing like the man I'd seen with a gun in his hand. How long has this been happening? We think 3 years, but he was careful at first. Small amounts. Meetings that could be explained as legitimate business. It wasn't until about 8 months ago that we noticed larger discrepancies and started dedicated surveillance. Christopher sat across from me, his expression controlled, but I could see tension in the line of his jaw. Nicholas is my underboss, second in command. He has access to operations most of my organization never sees. Suspecting him of betrayal is one thing. Proving it without starting a war is another. The weight of what he was saying settled over me. Your people trust him. Some do. Others are loyal to the structure, not the person. But I can't move against Nicholas without absolute proof, or I risk splitting the organization. Civil war in a structure like ours means bodies in the street, police attention we can't afford, opportunities for rivals to move in while we're distracted. I understood the calculation even as it turned my stomach. This wasn't about justice in any legal sense. It was about power, stability, control of an empire built on illegal foundations. Lucas had been collateral damage in that equation, a number that didn't balance. Where do I fit into this? I asked, meeting his eyes. You're the witness who can confirm Nicholas's meeting with cartel intermediaries happened without my knowledge or approval. The man you saw injured was Roberto Vitale, one of Nicholas's own people who questioned his authority. Nicholas ordered the beating to send a message about loyalty, but he did it in my club, on my property, without clearing it through me first. That's a violation of protocol serious enough to bring before the council. Christopher slid another document toward me. This one, a typed statement. This is your testimony. Everything you saw that night written in precise detail. You'll need to present this to 12 men who run various operations within my organization. They're the council that votes on major decisions, including disciplinary action against high-ranking members. I read through the statement, recognizing my own observations translated into formal language. The document was clinical, factual, stripping away all emotion from what had been a terrifying experience. What happens after I testify? If the council believes you, if they accept the evidence I've compiled, they'll vote on Nicholas's fate. Betrayal of this magnitude carries one sentence. Death. He didn't say it, but the meaning was clear. And if they don't believe me? Christopher's expression darkened. Then Nicholas walks out of that warehouse, and both of us become targets. He'll know you tried to expose him, and he'll eliminate that threat as quickly as possible. The stakes couldn't be clearer. I was betting my life on the word of men I'd never met. Criminals who operated by rules I didn't understand, hoping they'd value truth over loyalty to someone they'd worked with for years. When? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Tomorrow night. I've called an emergency session. Nicholas doesn't know what it's about yet, thinks it's related to territory disputes with the Russian crew on the north side. He won't expect an accusation from within. 1 day to prepare. 1 day to rehearse testimony that would either avenge my brother or get me killed. Christopher must have seen something in my expression because he leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. Sophia, you need to understand what you're walking into. These men are dangerous. They've built empires on violence and intimidation. Some of them are Nicholas's allies. They'll try to discredit you, make you seem unreliable, emotional, motivated by revenge rather than truth. You can't give them any openings. I know what I saw. Knowing isn't enough. You need to be unshakable. They'll ask the same questions different ways, trying to find inconsistencies in your story. They'll question your character, your motives, your connection to me. Every word you say will be examined for weakness. He stood, pacing to the window where late afternoon sun filtered through gaps in the blinds. I'm asking you to face men who would kill you without hesitation if they thought it was necessary. I'm asking you to stand in a room with your brother's murderer and speak calmly about how he died. That's not fair, and I know it. I watched him. This man I'd been secretly documenting for months, trying to understand the weight he carried. He wasn't offering me safety without cost. He was offering me a chance at justice that came with enormous risk, and he was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. My brother died because he told the truth about numbers on a page. I stood, moving to stand beside Christopher at the window. If I don't testify, Lucas's death means nothing. Nicholas wins, and someone else's brother dies next time. Someone else's sister. I won't let that happen. Christopher turned to face me, and for the first time since I'd met him, his carefully maintained distance faltered. He reached out, his hand hovering near my shoulder before dropping back to his side. You're braver than you know. I'm terrified. That's what makes it brave. The rest of that day passed in preparation. Christopher walked me through every possible question, every challenge I might face. He explained the hierarchy of the council, who would be sympathetic, who would be hostile, who could be swayed by compelling evidence. Joseph joined us periodically, offering insights from years of security work, teaching me how to maintain composure under pressure. As evening fell, Christopher ordered food, but neither of us ate much. The tension in the house was palpable, everyone aware that tomorrow would change everything. Either Nicholas Ferraro would face consequences for his crimes, or we'd be running for our lives. Around midnight, Christopher found me in the living room, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. He sat on the opposite end of the couch, leaving space between us that felt both respectful and lonely. I read your entire diary, he said quietly. Not just the parts about Nicholas, all of it. Heat flooded my face. I know. I'm sorry for writing about you like that, for observing you when I had no right. Don't apologize. He cut through my embarrassment. You saw me more clearly than most people who've known me for years. You wrote that I was lonely, that I carried weight I couldn't share. You were right. I didn't know how to respond to that confession. When you walk into that warehouse tomorrow, when you face the council and Nicholas, remember this. You're not just Sophia Wells, bartender with nothing to lose. You're the woman who saw through every defense I built, who recognized truth when everyone else saw power. That perception, that courage to name what others ignore, that's what will make them listen. His words settled over me like armor, fragile but necessary. Tomorrow, I would face my brother's killer. Tomorrow, I would speak truth to men who dealt in violence. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, in this anonymous house with Christopher Santoro watching me with something that looked almost like hope, I allowed myself to believe I might actually survive what came next. Morning arrived too quickly, gray light filtering through unfamiliar curtains in a bedroom that wasn't mine. I'd slept maybe 3 hours, fitful dreams of Lucas mixing with images of Nicholas Ferraro's predatory smile. My body ached from tension, muscles locked tight in anticipation of what was coming. Christopher knocked on my door at 7, his voice measured through the wood. We leave in 2 hours. Joseph is making breakfast. I dressed in the clothes laid out for me. Simple black pants and a charcoal sweater that Christopher's people had provided. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I needed to look credible, not vulnerable. The woman who walked into that warehouse tonight couldn't appear broken or desperate. She needed to embody certainty, no matter how hollow that certainty felt. In the kitchen, Joseph had prepared eggs and toast that I pushed around my plate without eating. Christopher sat across from me, his own meal similarly untouched. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken fears, but neither of us seemed capable of voicing them. The council expects precision, Christopher finally said, setting down his fork. When they ask you to describe what you saw, keep your answers direct. Don't elaborate unless they specifically request more detail. Don't volunteer information that wasn't asked for. I nodded, repeating the instructions I'd heard a dozen times already. Facts, not feelings. Observations, not interpretations. The clinical recitation of violence I'd witnessed, stripped of all emotion that might make me seem biased. Nicholas will be there, he continued. He'll try to rattle you, make you doubt yourself. Don't engage with him directly. Don't respond to anything he says unless a council member asks you to address it. Your testimony is for them, not for him. I understand. If at any point you feel unsafe, Joseph will be positioned near the exit. Just look at him and he'll get you out. The implication was clear. If things went badly, we'd need to run. Fast. We spent the next hour reviewing my statement one final time, Christopher asking me the same questions in different variations, testing my consistency. By the time we finished, my answers had become automatic, the words flowing without conscious thought. That was dangerous in its own way. I couldn't sound rehearsed. Couldn't give them any reason to think this testimony had been coached or manipulated. At 9:30, we loaded into Joseph's car. The drive to the warehouse took 40 minutes, winding through industrial areas where factories sat empty and streets were lined with chain-link fencing. This was the part of Chicago tourists never saw, where legitimate business gave way to operations that thrived in shadows. The warehouse itself was nondescript, a gray building with few windows and heavy metal doors. Joseph parked in back, and Christopher placed a hand on my shoulder before I could open the car door. Once we're inside, everything changes. These men won't see you as Sophia Wells, bartender trying to find justice. They'll see you as a potential threat, someone who could expose operations they've spent years building. Some will want to believe you because it serves their interests. Others will want you discredited because Nicholas is their ally. Remember that every question has layers. I took a breath, steadying myself. I'm ready. We entered through a side door into a space that had clearly been prepared for this meeting. 12 chairs arranged in a semicircle, a single chair positioned in the center facing them. Industrial lighting overhead cast harsh shadows. No windows, one exit besides the door we'd come through, guarded by 2 men I didn't recognize. The council members were already arriving, men in their 40s and 50s, dressed in variations of expensive casual wear. They spoke in low tones, acknowledgments passing between them that suggested long familiarity. Christopher greeted each by name, his demeanor shifting into something more formal, more distant than the man I'd spent the last week with. Nicholas Ferraro arrived last, flanked by 2 of his own men. He saw me immediately, his expression flickering through surprise before settling into cold calculation. I forced myself to meet his gaze briefly before looking away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. The council members took their seats. Christopher stood at one end of the semicircle, a position that suggested authority without claiming dominance. Joseph positioned himself near the exit as promised, his presence reassuring. An older man with silver hair and sharp eyes called the meeting to order. His name was Anthony Grimaldiro, and Christopher had identified him as someone sympathetic to our position, someone who valued organizational stability over personal loyalty. We're here tonight to address accusations of unauthorized operations and betrayal of trust within our structure. Anthony's voice carried authority earned over decades. Christopher Santoro has presented evidence of irregularities that require council review. Mr. Ferraro, you've been accused of conducting business without proper approval, of making alliances that threaten our organization. How do you respond? Nicholas stood, his posture relaxed, confident. These accusations are politically motivated. Christopher has been looking for ways to consolidate power, to eliminate anyone who questions his decisions. I've done nothing outside the scope of my authority as underboss. Then you won't object to testimony from a witness who observed your operations firsthand. Nicholas's jaw tightened fractionally. I have no idea what witness you're referring to. Anthony gestured to me. Miss Wells, please come forward. I stood on legs that felt unsteady, walking to the chair positioned in the center of the semicircle. 12 pairs of eyes tracked my movement, assessing, judging. I sat carefully, forcing my hands to rest loosely in my lap rather than gripping the chair arms. State your name and your connection to this organization, Anthony instructed. Sophia Wells. I worked as a bartender at Crimson Lounge for 6 months. My voice came out clearer than I'd expected. And you witnessed something that brought you here tonight? Yes. On Saturday, November 16th, I was asked to deliver a bottle of whiskey to a private meeting on the 2nd floor. When I entered the room, I observed 5 men, including Mr. Ferraro, conducting what appeared to be a business meeting. One man was injured, bleeding from facial wounds. Mr. Ferraro was holding a gun. Murmurs rippled through the council. Nicholas remained standing, his expression carefully neutral. Describe exactly what you saw, another council member demanded, a heavy-set man with a Boston accent. Don't summarize. Details. I recited my prepared statement, describing the positioning of each person, the condition of the injured man, the conversation fragments I'd overheard. I mentioned Nicholas's demeanor, the deference shown to him by the others present, the way they'd looked to him for direction. The injured man was Roberto Vitale, I concluded. I later learned he'd questioned Mr. Ferraro's authority and was being disciplined. And how did you learn this? Nicholas finally spoke, his tone sharp. You're claiming knowledge of internal operations based on what? Exactly? Gossip? Assumptions? I'm claiming knowledge based on what I observed directly, I responded, keeping my gaze on Anthony rather than Nicholas, and based on information provided by Mr. Santoro after I brought my concerns to his attention. Convenient that you went to Christopher with this story, Nicholas countered, especially given that you've been under his protection for the past week. How do we know your testimony isn't fabricated to serve his political interests? Several council members nodded, the question clearly resonating. Anthony held up a hand. Miss Wells, what motivated you to come forward with this information? What do you gain from testifying against Mr. Ferraro? This was the critical moment. I could feel everyone's attention sharpening, waiting for my answer. My brother Lucas Wells was murdered 2 years ago. He worked as an accountant for Westfield Import and discovered financial irregularities. The man responsible for my brother's death was in that room on Saturday night. I finally looked directly at Nicholas. I recognized him from security footage taken the night Lucas died. Nicholas Ferraro killed my brother to cover up his theft and betrayal of this organization. The warehouse erupted into overlapping voices, council members demanding clarification, Nicholas shouting denials. Anthony banged his hand against the chair arm, calling for order. That's a serious accusation, he said once quiet returned. Do you have proof? Christopher stepped forward, pulling out a folder. Security camera footage from 2 years ago showing Nicholas leaving the alley where Lucas Wells was found. Financial records documenting millions diverted from approved accounts into structures Nicholas controls. Surveillance photos of Nicholas meeting with Sinaloa cartel representatives without authorization. Phone records, transaction logs, witness statements from people Nicholas dealt with. It's all here. He handed the folder to Anthony, who began reviewing its contents with increasingly grave expression. Nicholas's facade cracked. This is fabricated evidence. Christopher's been planning this coup for months, and now he's using some grieving bartender to... The financial records can't be fabricated. Another council member interrupted, looking at documents over Anthony's shoulder. These are our own internal accounts. The diversions are real. And the cartel meetings, added a third member. If Nicholas has been promising territory without council approval, that's a direct violation of our structure. The tide was turning. I could see it in their faces, the shift from skepticism to concern. Nicholas felt it too. His posture changed, becoming defensive rather than confident. I did what was necessary for our survival, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. Christopher's been too cautious, too risk-averse. The Sinaloa connection gives us protection, resources we need to compete with. You don't make those decisions alone. Anthony cut him off. That's what the council exists for. You acted outside your authority, stole from us, killed a civilian to protect your operations, and made deals that could bring war to our streets. Those aren't survival tactics. That's betrayal. The room fell silent. Even Nicholas seemed to recognize he'd lost. Anthony looked around the semicircle. All in favor of moving forward with disciplinary action? Hands rose one after another until 11 of 12 council members had voted. Only one abstained, an older man who'd sat silent throughout the entire proceeding. The council has spoken. Anthony's voice carried finality. Nicholas Ferraro, you're stripped of all authority and sentenced according to our laws for betrayal of this magnitude. What happened next was swift and efficient. Nicholas's own bodyguards were dismissed by order of the council. Joseph and 2 other men escorted Nicholas toward a door I hadn't noticed before, his protests growing louder before being cut off as the door closed behind them. I didn't watch. Didn't need to. Justice in this world looked different than what I'd imagined when I'd started searching for Lucas's killer 2 years ago. But it was justice nonetheless. Anthony approached me as the other council members began departing. "Your brother's death is avenged. That should bring you some peace." It does. And surprisingly, it was true. Christopher appeared at my side, his hand finding mine. "Let's go home." Home. I wasn't sure where that was anymore, but with Christopher's fingers wrapped around mine and the weight of testimony finally lifted from my shoulders, I was ready to find out. The warehouse emptied quickly after the council's verdict. Men departed without ceremony. Their business concluded. Their votes cast. Nicholas Ferraro had been escorted through that back door, and I didn't ask what happened beyond it. Some truths were better left unconfirmed, consequences accepted without witnessing their execution. Christopher remained at my side as Joseph brought the car around. The industrial area was dark now, streetlights few and far between, the kind of neighborhood where people learned not to notice what happened after hours. We drove in silence through empty streets, leaving behind the place where justice of a particular kind had been served. I expected to return to the safe house, to another anonymous bedroom where I'd try to sleep while processing everything that had happened. Instead, Joseph headed back toward the city, toward neighborhoods I recognized, upscale areas where glass towers reflected city lights. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. "Somewhere you can start over," Christopher said. "If that's what you want." The car stopped in front of a residential building in the Gold Coast, the kind of address that appeared in real estate magazines with price tags I'd never dreamed of affording. A doorman opened the car door before I could question further, greeting Christopher by name with the familiarity of long acquaintance. We rode an elevator to the 15th floor, Christopher using a key card to access a penthouse unit. The door opened onto a space that took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, hardwood floors gleaming under subtle lighting, furniture that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, original artwork on the walls, a kitchen with equipment that would make a professional chef weep, bedrooms that suggested this wasn't just a showpiece, but a home. "This is yours?" I walked to the windows, drawn by the view of water stretching to darkness. "One of my properties. I use it occasionally when I need space from everything else." Christopher moved to the kitchen, opening a cabinet to reveal bottles of whiskey and wine. "But it's been sitting mostly empty for the past year. That seems wasteful." He poured 2 glasses of whiskey. Neat. And brought one to me. I took it but didn't drink immediately, still trying to understand why he'd brought me here. "The medical debt," Christopher said quietly. "The $47,000 Lucas's treatment left behind. I had it paid off this morning. You'll receive confirmation from the collection agency within the week." The glass nearly slipped from my fingers. "Christopher, I can't accept that. It's too much. It's not charity. It's restitution. Your brother died because of my organization's failure to stop Nicholas. The least I can do is remove the financial burden his death created." He set his own glass down, turning to face me fully. "Sophia, I'm not offering this as payment for your testimony. You earned justice tonight through your own courage. This is separate, a debt I owe regardless of what happened in that warehouse." I struggled to process the magnitude of what he was saying. The debt that had defined my existence for 2 years. The crushing weight that determined every choice I made was simply gone, erased with a single transaction that meant everything to me and probably barely registered in Christopher's finances. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. "There's more." Christopher moved to the kitchen counter where a manila envelope sat. "Ryan called while we were at the warehouse. He's been worried about you. Wanted to make sure you were safe. I had Joseph update him that you're okay, but that you won't be returning to Crimson Lounge. I expected that. Losing the job hurt less than I'd anticipated. That life, the invisibility I'd cultivated, no longer fit who I'd become. I've also arranged for a stipend, monthly payments that will cover your living expenses while you figure out what comes next. Whether that's finishing your business degree, pursuing something else entirely, taking time to simply exist without the pressure of constant work." He slid the envelope toward me. "The details are in here, along with documentation that this apartment is yours for as long as you need it." I stared at the envelope, overwhelmed. "You're giving me an apartment. I'm giving you options. You can stay here, find your own place, move to another city entirely if you want distance from everything that happened. The choice is yours, Sophia. For the first time in years, the choice is actually yours. The weight of that freedom was almost as heavy as the debt had been. I'd spent so long surviving, so focused on the next shift and the next payment, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to imagine a future beyond basic existence. What about you? I asked. What happens to you now that Nicholas is gone? Christopher's expression grew thoughtful. I rebuild, fill the power vacuum he left, strengthen alliances he damaged, repair trust he destroyed. There will be challenges, people questioning whether I should have seen his betrayal sooner, whether I'm still capable of leadership. He picked up his whiskey glass, studying the amber liquid. But that's my world, my responsibility. I won't pretend it's anything other than what it is. I moved closer, setting my own glass down beside his. And us? What are we? The question hung between us, acknowledging what had been building beneath everything else. The connection that had started with diary observations and grown through shared danger. The understanding that passed between us without words. That depends on what you want. Christopher's voice was careful, giving me space to define whatever this was. I read your diary, Sophia. I know you saw something in me worth documenting, worth trying to understand. But I also know the reality of my life, the darkness that comes with it. I won't lie and say being close to me is safe or simple. It's neither of those things. I'm not asking for simple. I reached for his hand, feeling the warmth of his fingers against mine. I'm asking if you meant what you said in the safe house. About me seeing past your defenses. About that mattering to you. I meant every word. His thumb traced circles against my palm, the gesture oddly tender from a man capable of orchestrating what had happened tonight. You looked at me and saw loneliness, isolation, burden. Everyone else sees power. That difference is everything. I thought about the weeks I'd spent writing about him in my diary, trying to decode the careful distance he maintained from his own inner circle. I'd been drawn to his complexity, to the contradiction of violence and gentleness, authority and isolation. That fascination hadn't been one-sided, I realized. He'd read my observations and recognized himself in them, seen through my eyes what he couldn't articulate himself. So what happens now? I asked. Now you decide what you want your life to look like. No pressure, no expectations. You stay here as long as you need to. Use the resources I'm offering. Figure out who you are, when survival isn't the only priority. Christopher squeezed my hand gently. And when you're ready, if you want me to be part of that life, I'll be here. If you don't, if you decide you need distance from everything connected to what happened, I'll accept that too. It was the kind of offer that recognized my autonomy while making clear his own desires. No manipulation. No strings beyond what I chose to accept. After years of having choices made for me by circumstances, by debt, by Lucas's death and its aftermath, Christopher was handing me control of my own future. I want to stay. The decision came without internal debate, feeling right in a way few things had since Lucas died. Not because I'm grateful for what you did, not because I feel obligated. I want to stay because I still see that person I wrote about in my diary, and I want to know him better. The real version, not the one I constructed from observation. Relief flickered across Christopher's face before his usual composure reasserted itself. Then stay. Take the bedroom overlooking the lake. Make yourself at home. Tomorrow we can discuss practical matters, next steps, whatever you need. Tonight, just breathe. I did. For the first time in what felt like years, I took a full breath without the weight of impossible debt crushing my chest. Lucas was avenged. Nicholas was gone. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer defined solely by survival. Christopher showed me to the master bedroom, pointing out amenities with the slightly awkward courtesy of someone unaccustomed to hosting guests in personal space. The bathroom was larger than my entire studio apartment had been, the closet already filled with clothes in my size that he'd apparently had delivered while we were at the warehouse. If you need anything, I'll be in the guest room. Or if you can't sleep, if you need company, just knock. He paused in the doorway. And Sophia, thank you for being brave enough to testify, for trusting me enough to accept protection. I know that wasn't easy. After he left, I stood in the center of that beautiful bedroom, trying to reconcile this reality with the life I'd been living just weeks ago. Everything had changed so quickly, violently, completely, but I was still here, still standing, still capable of imagining tomorrow. I pulled out my diary, the leather worn smooth from years of handling, and opened to the first blank page at the back. For 2 years, I'd written about grief, debt, survival. I'd documented Christopher from a distance, trying to understand him through careful observation. Now I had the chance to know him directly, to write new chapters that weren't defined by loss. I wrote, "Tonight Lucas was avenged. Tomorrow I start becoming whoever I'm meant to be. The future is mine to write." The words look small on the page, inadequate to capture the enormity of transformation. But they were a beginning. And for the first time since Lucas died, a beginning felt like possibility, rather than just survival. I closed the diary and set it on the nightstand, then moved to the window overlooking the lake. Chicago stretched below, millions of lights marking lives being lived, choices being made, futures being written. Mine was one among millions, no longer invisible, no longer defined solely by what I'd lost. Christopher Santoro had given me justice and freedom both. What I did with them was entirely up to me. And standing in that penthouse overlooking the city, I realized I was ready to find out.